Welcome back, everybody. Today we're going on a deep dive into a pretty fascinating book. It's called The Uses and Abuses of History, and it's written by Margaret MacMillan.
It is
It
fascinating.
really digs into how history, shapes our world.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Macmillan really takes us beyond those sort of like typical historical narratives, dates and names and battles,
Right.
and dives into how history is used and, importantly, misused to justify actions, to create identities, and even to state claims in the present.
It's really about understanding how history is leveraged,
Right.
right? Which
Yeah.
is so crucial in navigating today's world, wouldn't you say?
Oh, absolutely. The book actually starts by highlighting what I think is a really interesting paradox.
Okay.
On the one hand, history is incredibly popular, right? Like
Yeah.
everybody's into history these days.
You see it everywhere.
But at the same time, you have those who dismiss it as irrelevant.
Right.
Even like Henry Ford, who very famously said that history is bunk. So how can something be both widely consumed and disregarded?
It's a good question.
Well, that tension is exactly what Macmillan wants us to kind of like grapple with, I think.
Explore.
Yeah. So on the one hand, you have museums overflowing with visitors, you have historical TV shows and documentaries, um, a booming market for all of this. But on the other hand, there's this tendency to cherry pick facts.
Right. Simplify narratives to fit preconceived notions.
Exactly. And so this selective use of history can be incredibly misleading.
Absolutely. And this kind of leads into her first major point, I think, about the need for history.
Yeah.
She argues that, like, after the Cold War, history kind of had this resurgence. This was especially true in places like the Balkans, where there was conflict.
Oh, yeah.
Suddenly, the old world order was crumbling, and people needed historical context to make sense of the shifting alliances and, all these tensions that were resurfacing.
Right. I mean, when familiar structures collapse, people often turn to history for explanations and guidance. It's a way to make sense of the chaos.
Try to, anyway.
But unfortunately, this can also lead to oversimplifications or the dredging up of old grievances, to kind of fuel conflict.
Fuel the fire.
Yeah.
MacMillan dives into this whole, what she calls history craze,
Mm-hmm.
and she explores the reasons why people are drawn to the past.
Interesting. Right.
Some are looking for comfort, validation. Others are trying to find a sense of belonging or, a deeper understanding of the world.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that?
Well, Macmillan argues that personal and collective identities are deeply intertwined with our understanding of history. We use history to answer fundamental questions like, who am I? And where do I fit in?
Big questions.
Yeah, we draw upon family history, cultural heritage, national narratives, even the histories of groups we identify with to create a sense of belonging and continuity.
It's like constructing a narrative thread that connects us to something larger than ourselves, right?
Yes, and that connection can be very powerful. Like you said, it can give us a sense of purpose and meaning. But it's also important to remember that history can be a source of division and conflict, particularly when it's used to justify, less than noble actions.
Yeah, and this takes us to another key point that MacMillan makes, that history can be used to legitimize power.
Oh, definitely.
She gives these examples of leaders throughout history who have invoked historical comparisons to justify their actions, to make themselves look better.
Yeah, think about President Bush comparing himself to Truman during the early days of the Iraq War.
Right. Or Putin comparing himself to Peter the Great when justifying the invasion of Ukraine.
Exactly. These comparisons can be very persuasive, but they can also be really misleading, especially if the historical context is not fully understood,
Or if they oversimplify, like a really complex situation.
Yeah.
So what do you think, how can we avoid falling into that trap?
Well, Macmillan urges us to be critical thinkers when we're engaging with these historical narratives,
Okay.
especially when they're used to justify actions in the present,
Right.
We need to be wary of those who use history to silence dissent or demonize opponents.
It happens all the time.
It does.
We should always ask, who is telling this story? What evidence are they using?
What perspectives might be missing, that kind of thing.
Yeah. This skepticism is essential, especially when history is used to justify, present-day conflicts or to claim ownership of land and resources.
Oh, absolutely.
And this leads to that thought-provoking question that MacMillan poses. Who owns the past? She acknowledges that history belongs to everyone, but she emphasizes the role of historians those who are actually studying and interpreting and analyzing history.
Right. She argues that professional historians, through their training and commitment to evidence-based analysis, can really help us navigate the complexities of the past and avoid falling prey to simplistic narratives.
Or outright fabrications.
Yeah.
But she's not saying that only academics can understand or interpret history.
No, not at all.
But she does believe that a rigorous, evidence-based approach is necessary to make sure that history is grounded in fact, not just wishful thinking or political expediency.
Right.
However, she also acknowledges that professional historians are often criticized for, like, being elitist or out of touch with the real world.
Yeah, that happens especially when their research challenges popular beliefs
Yeah,
or national myths.
right. It's a delicate balance.
Yeah.
And that's where the concept of memory comes in. MacMillan points out that personal memories, they're often very selective, they're malleable, they can be easily influenced by changing times and attitudes.
Yeah.
This means that relying solely on personal accounts or anecdotal evidence can lead to a distorted understanding of the past.
Right, and this is where the professional historians can help. They can provide a framework for critically examining these personal memories and corroborating them with other sources of evidence.
So we see how these competing versions of history play out in various conflicts, which is something that we'll be discussing in the next part of our deep dive.
Thank you for listening to Rambling Dan Rowe's Deep Dive Book Reviews. Please help support our channel by clicking the like and subscribe button. Thank you.
Welcome back to our deep dive into Margaret MacMillan's The Uses and Abuses of History. Before the break, we were discussing the role of professional historians, and the challenges they face when confronting popular narratives.
And a key aspect of those challenges is the issue of memory and how it shapes our understanding of history. MacMillan argues that relying solely on personal memories can be problematic because memories are fluid, they're subjective, and they can be easily influenced by changing times and attitudes.
She uses the example of veterans recalling their wartime experiences. And while their accounts are undoubtedly valuable, it's crucial to remember that they're also shaped by the passage of time, by the individual's desire to make sense of their actions, and by the broader societal narratives that emerge after a conflict.
It's not that these personal memories are intentionally false or misleading, right? It's more that memory itself is a reconstructive process, not a perfect recording of events.
This recognition of memory's limitations is especially crucial when considering conflicts over things like land, resources, or identity. MacMillan provides several compelling examples of how conflicting historical narratives fuel these disputes.
Take, for instance, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, where both sides draw upon historical claims and interpretations of events to support their positions.
Yet the same can be said for Aboriginal land claims in Canada, where historical treaties and the impact of colonization are fiercely debated.
Right.
In these instances, history becomes a battleground, with each side selectively choosing evidence to support their claims, and often ignoring or downplaying contradictory information. This selective use of history can exacerbate existing tensions and make finding common ground even more challenging.
MacMillan doesn't shy away from these difficult issues, though. She acknowledges that history is often intertwined with deeply held beliefs and emotions, which can make it difficult to have objective discussions.
Sure.
However, she also argues that it's precisely because of these complexities that a nuanced and critical approach to history is so essential.
It's about recognizing that there are multiple perspectives, that evidence can be interpreted in different ways, and that history is never truly settled or fixed.
This leads us to another important theme in the book, the concept of history wars. MacMillan explores how disagreements over historical interpretation can erupt into heated debates about what should be remembered, how it should be commemorated, and whose voices should be privileged.
She provides vivid examples of these history wars playing out in various arenas, from museums and textbooks to national holidays and public memorials.
One particularly striking example is the controversy surrounding the Smithsonian's planned exhibit of the Enola Gay, the aircraft that dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima. Veterans groups and some politicians fiercely objected to the exhibit's focus on the devastating consequences of the bombing.
Really?
Yeah, they argued that it presented a biased and disrespectful portrayal of American actions.
Interesting.
The controversy ultimately led to the cancellation of the original exhibit, highlighting the power of competing historical narratives and the challenges of presenting a balanced and nuanced view of the past.
Similar debates have erupted over the content of history textbooks, particularly when dealing with sensitive topics, like slavery, colonialism, or genocide. These history wars underscore the fact that history is not a neutral or objective field.
It's a site of ongoing struggle over meaning, memory, and identity.
And MacMillan argues that these struggles are not necessarily a bad thing.
Right.
No. Open debate and critical examination of the past, even when it's uncomfortable or challenging, are essential for a healthy democracy. By grappling with different perspectives and interpretations, we can gain a deeper understanding of the past and its impact on the present.
So if history is this contested and malleable, can it truly serve as a guide for present-day decision-making?
That's the question.
That's a big one. That's the question that MacMillan tackles in the book's final chapter, and it's a question that has preoccupied thinkers for centuries. She presents both the optimistic and pessimistic views on this issue, acknowledging that history can offer valuable insights, but also cautioning against simplistic comparisons and misapplications of the past.
One of the most common pitfalls is the misuse of historical analogies, where a particular historical event is invoked to justify a current course of action, without sufficient attention to the differences in context or the complexities of the situation.
The classic example is the Munich analogy, where the appeasement of Hitler in 1938 was frequently used to argue against any form of negotiation or compromise with adversaries, even when the historical circumstances were vastly different.
Right.
This type of simplistic historical reasoning can lead to disastrous consequences, as seen in the case of the Vietnam War, where the Munich analogy was repeatedly used to justify escalating American involvement.
MacMillan urges us to be wary of these facile comparisons, to recognize that history rarely offers clear-cut answers or easy solutions. Instead, she advocates for a more nuanced, critical approach to the past, one that recognizes the complexities, ambiguities, and unintended consequences of human actions.
This doesn't mean that we should dismiss history as irrelevant or unreliable.
Right.
Rather, it means that we need to approach it with humility, with skepticism, and a willingness to question our assumptions. We need to be aware of our own biases, recognize the limitations of memory, and seek out multiple perspectives.
Ultimately, MacMillan argues that history should challenge our thinking, not simply confirm it.
It should prompt us to ask difficult questions, consider alternative viewpoints, and grapple with the ethical dilemmas of the past. And by engaging in this ongoing dialogue with history, we can gain a deeper understanding of ourselves, our societies, and the forces that shape our world.
That's a really great point. You know, this deep dive has definitely made me realize that history is much more nuanced and complex than I initially thought. It's not just about memorizing dates and battles. It's about understanding the forces that have shaped the world we live in and the choices we make today.
And it's a dialogue that we're all a part of. Our understanding of history shapes how we view the world, how we make decisions, and how we interact with each other. So the next time you encounter a historical narrative, take a moment to pause, reflect, and ask yourself, what's the story behind the story?
That's such a great takeaway for our listeners. We've explored how history can be both illuminating and misleading, how it shapes our identities and fuels our conflicts, and how it can both guide and misguide us.
MacMillan's book doesn't provide easy answers, but it does offer a framework for engaging with history in a more thoughtful and critical way. She reminds us that history is not just a subject to be studied, it's a lens through which we understand ourselves and the world around us.
And for those who want to delve deeper into this fascinating exploration of history and its impact, I highly recommend picking up The Uses and Abuses of History by Margaret MacMillan.
It's a thought-provoking and insightful read. It'll change the way you view the past and its enduring influence on the present. It's a journey of intellectual discovery.
It will challenge your assumptions and leave you with a deeper appreciation for the power and complexity of history.
Thank you for listening to Rambling Dan Rowe's Deep Dive Book Reviews. Please help support our channel by clicking the like and subscribe button. Thank you.
Welcome back to our deep dive into Margaret MacMillan's The Uses and Abuses of History. We've covered a lot of ground, from the allure of historical narratives to the dangers of their misuse.
Right.
But where does all this leave us? You know, what are we supposed to do with this newfound awareness of how easily history can be manipulated?
Well, that's really the key question MacMillan grapples with in her concluding chapter.
Okay.
It's called History as Guide and Friend. And she doesn't offer simple answers or a list of do's and don'ts when it comes to engaging with history. Instead, she emphasizes the importance of cultivating a critical mindset, not just taking everything at face value.
So it's not about rejecting history altogether,
No, not at all.
but about approaching it with a healthy dose of skepticism and a willingness to question what we're told.
Exactly. It's like, think of it this way. You wouldn't just accept any random article you find online as fact, would you? You'd probably check the source, look for corroborating evidence, consider different perspectives.
Of course, we're naturally more cautious with information we find online. I mean, there's so much misinformation out there.
Right,
Right.
exactly. And it's the same with history. We need to develop those critical thinking skills and apply them to the historical narratives we encounter.
Being said,
So ask yourself, who's telling this story?
what are the motivations?
What evidence are they presenting and what might be missing? That kind of thing.
So it's almost like becoming like a historical detective, piecing together the clues
Yeah,
and considering different interpretations to try to get a more complete and accurate picture.
precisely. And don't be afraid to challenge your own assumptions, too.
Oh, that's a good point.
Like, what preconceived notions are you bringing to the table? How might those be influencing your understanding of the past?
MacMillan really encourages us to be aware of those potential biases that can shape our views.
Right, whether they are based on personal experience, cultural background, political beliefs, all of that.
It's about recognizing that history is not this like static collection of facts. It's a living, breathing dialogue that's constantly evolving.
Absolutely. As we uncover new evidence and reinterpret old narratives and ask new questions.
This whole deep dive has really made me realize that history is much more nuanced and complex than I initially thought. It's not just about memorizing dates and battles. It's about understanding the forces that have shaped the world we live in and the choices that we make today.
And it's a dialogue that we're all a part of. Our understanding of history shapes how we view the world, how we make decisions, and how we interact with each other. So the next time you encounter a historical narrative, take a moment to pause and reflect and ask yourself, what's the story behind the story?
That's such a great takeaway. For everyone listening, I think we've done a pretty good job exploring how history can be both illuminating and misleading. How it shapes our identities and fuels our conflicts.
We've seen how it can both guide and misguide us.
Exactly.
And while MacMillan's book doesn't provide easy answers, it does offer a framework for engaging with history in a more thoughtful and critical way.
I think that's really what she's getting at.
She reminds us that history is not just a subject to be studied. It's a lens through which we understand ourselves and the world around us.
And for those who want to delve deeper into this fascinating exploration of history and its impact, I highly recommend picking up The Uses and Abuses of History by Margaret MacMillan. It's a really thought-provoking read. It'll change the way you view the past.
It will. It's a journey of intellectual discovery that'll challenge your assumptions and leave you with a deeper appreciation for the power and complexity of history.
Well, that's about all the time we have for today. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.